All right. Next speaker is Nathan Willis, and speaking about want fewer font bugs, we'll try fewer font packages. We look forward to listening about this.
Thanks. That's not actually the title that I put in the CFP or is in the schedule, but it's the same idea. So hopefully that'll not inhibit your ability to follow. Before I start, I'd like to spend 30 minutes discussing Rust. I'm just kidding. I would like to take a survey of the room. If you're here and you maintain a font package in Debian or in some other distribution, could you raise your hand? Okay, a few. What if you work? Raise your hand if you work on like translation or internationalization support. Anybody? Okay, some other people. All right, I think this might be of interest to you. Like it said on the slide, my name is Nate Willis. I'm a typeface designer. I'm currently a PhD student in England at the University of Reading. I research automated spacing and kerning and text positioning and stuff like that. Mostly my free software work has to do with fonts. Recently I spent a lot of time writing font-related documentation as well. But I'm not a font package maintainer. This is actually sort of a story, so it has chapters. It begins in March. Travel back in your mind's eye to March. There was a GNOME Hackfest for parental controls and meter data in London at the vast corporate Red Hat office there. And I went because it was close by. I used to live in a place where there was never a Hackfest locally, and I actually wanted to participate in that. I contributed nothing. Oh, I got the date wrong on that too. I did answer some random font questions while I was there and some internationalization questions and that sort of thing. Among those random questions, at one point Richard Hughes, who works on a lot of like package level stuff in GNOME and in Fedora, sort of turned around and asked me an obscure question about TTC files. TTC files are true type collection files. They're true type fonts with like multiple true type fonts merged together in one file with the duplicate stuff taken out. I didn't know a ton about them, about the specifics he was asking about, but that was what opened the door. There we discussed why he was interested in TTC files. Turns out it was about fixing font packages on Fedora Silverblue. If you're not familiar with Fedora Silverblue, it's a transactional OS distribution or an immutable OS distribution. There's several different terms for this. It's what used to be called Atomic Workstation in the Red Hat world. And what it means is that the root file system is read-only. The way they're working on it is user applications are only installed, well, for them only in Flatpak, but for other designs of this type, Snap packages and other formats are acceptable too. And those applications live in a little cheroot jail, and they have a little file system of their own that they're sandboxed into, and they don't touch the immutable root file system. And when you do need to change something at the root file system, you have to reboot. So there's actually several of these out there right now. Silverblue Endless OS is another one. Ubuntu Core, which I think is the same thing that used to be Ubuntu Snappy Core. And Docker apparently has something where everything runs in a Docker container, but the OS is immutable. And then there's this thing called GNU GUIX. I know you're going to hear people tell you to pronounce that differently. Don't. That's not how language works. So there's a lot of these things out there, and people are rethinking this now that these sort of user-installed Snap and Flatpak formats are becoming popular. And the thing is, installing a font requires you to reboot the system. And in fact, every font requires you to reboot the system. When you make a change, it's done in an overlay file system, and so usually you would have two partitions, and you'd do it in the other one, then reboot into the updated partition. And that gets old pretty quick, right? Even worse, it turns out you can't put fonts into a standard Snap or Flatpak package like you do with all the other end-user applications. And fonts are generally end-user things. The reason being that these formats are designed to never touch the user directory. And should I talk quieter? Or? Okay. And the fonts that are in an application sandbox, like a Flatpak or a Snap, are not visible to applications that live in other Flatpaks and Snaps. There is something, at least in Flatpak, called an extension, which is sort of a workaround. It means you're creating something that's not an application, but still gets put into the overlay system sort of beneath the applications. But in practice, having hundreds of those for hundreds of fonts would kill the overlay file system machinery. So that's not going to work. Anyway, ultimately, when you think about this problem and how fonts cause you to reboot every time you install one, the problem boils down to the fact that they're installed into the user directory. And that's in spite of the fact that fontconfig, which is how fonts are located by an application, supports other directories. In fact, a lot of other directories. Like by default, you also have user local share, and then you have two things inside the user's home directory, the .local, and then .fonts, which is deprecated these days, but can still be used. And then essentially anywhere else. You can just modify a font config to look anywhere else. And when it sees a new font, you just rebuild the font config cache and you're ready to go. So isn't the solution here just to not install the font into user anymore? That's the impression I got from discussing this with Richard for a little bit, and I finally said to him, wait, what if the distributions just stopped packaging the fonts altogether? And it seemed immediately like a great burden had been lifted from Richard's shoulders. And I'm kidding a little bit on that. You definitely would expect the distribution to provide language support for people. That's important, and it needs to work out of the box. So you can't rely on something that is only installed into a home directory later on by someone. And you could certainly make a case that there are certain fonts that you need to print documents or to make sure that console access works, what have you. There's the generics. You need to have something that matches sans or serif or mono that a program might request through fontconfig. But there is potentially this minimal set of fonts, and everything else is a font that is selected by the user for some particular reason, for some reason specific to the font. And the distros could lock down that minimal set and stop carrying the maintenance burden on all those other packages. That's sort of what I'm getting at here. So in that model, the OS maintains these font packages that install the user and are required, and then everything else just installs to the user's home directory, home fonts, so to speak. And that includes font binaries, but also the support material. Well, to be honest, what would happen? Nothing would break, right? If this was actually working today, then fontconfig would find all of those fonts as normal. You would see them in your applications as normal. Maybe certain system applications wouldn't see them. Maybe if you are still one of the few people using a multi-user system, different users would have different fonts installed, so that would be different. But definitely those Flatpak and Snap problems would be solved. So the question is, if nothing breaks and if this fixes stuff for the Flatpak people, is that everything? Is that all that happens? Is it all that matters? I kept thinking about this over the next few weeks, and I think there's some other angles to consider. So last year, I had finished doing a master's degree, and I was just doing like part-time contract stuff. So I started messing around with what I considered to be the pain points of working with fonts on desktop Linux systems. Primarily, this meant that I was spending my time tricking developers into doing things. And a lot of that was happening anyway. There's a lot of work in GTK land and in the OpenType spec, so I would just sort of like, hey, could we also get this other nice little addition made? And if you were unfortunate enough last year to see my DebConf talk, I covered a lot of what I thought those pain points were in that. I'll send a link to that at the end, so if you're still awake, you can check that out if you want. But I'm talking about things like making sure the metadata is accessible in applications, how you actually manage your font collection, turning things off and on, making sure license information is tracked correctly, and then also just the usability of installing it, so that sort of thing. And one of the easiest takeaways is that the desktop Linux system is extremely weird for having fonts that are installed in more than one, through more than one method. And by that I mean there's distribution packaged fonts, and then there's the fonts that the user brings through some other means, like they downloaded them or they built them locally. Other OSs don't do this. Like Apple and Microsoft, they will come with some core fonts on the installation media or pre-installed on a machine, but you don't fetch others from Apple and from Microsoft. In reality, people on proprietary operating systems get their additional fonts from font vendors, maybe from Adobe, maybe from Font Shop or something like that. But they don't come through the distribution or the equivalent to the distribution. And the fact that we do this in two different ways actually makes things harder. Font management is more difficult. There's a lot of like competing, not quite featureful font managers, and they take different approaches. Some of them deactivate a font by moving it out of that .local share fonts directory into somewhere else, and it makes it harder to track metadata. You have to scan multiple directories for things. You have to deduplicate the stuff that you find. You have to disambiguate what the font name means because it could match multiple places. So there's a lot of things that are actually more complicated because we support having fonts in several places. In fact, when we're talking about Debian, because we support hundreds of fonts, you potentially could have 700 font packages or so. And the thing is, like, of these two methods, the one that comes from the distro works fine. You use apt, and you can, for the most part, find a font if you're looking for it. I would like to see some more metadata visible in software centers, but it works. Whereas the experience for downloading a font through any other means is pretty grim. And by that I mean this is it. You download something and then you need to know what to do from there. GNOME or GTK does have a sort of a font installer, but it just, you have to open the font binary with it and then it knows where to put it. Everything else gets lost. All right. I used to, when I was doing this stuff about like the pain points of fonts, I used to sort of complain publicly. It's just weird. Fonts are weird. They're half data and they're half code. They're user content, but they're system packages. They live in multiple places. Nothing else in the system is quite like that, right? Then Tom Marble, if you know Tom Marble, set me straight on this on Twitter. He's like, no, that's exactly the same thing that happens with language-specific modules and libraries. And, you know, Python and Perl and the tech community all seem to have some sort of solution to doing this. And actually that's true when you stop and think about it, because you have executables that live in the user's home directory, and you have libraries that are installed that are visible only to the user's Python and not to the system Python. And the distribution has got used to this, and well, for the most part, I mean, it's not a perfect world. It does have some advantages, though. By sort of locking down the system Python, there's less QA, and you sort of hand off maintenance of the thousands of libraries and modules to this language-specific community that runs CTAN or CRAN or one of those things. And you get packages that one package will install on almost any distribution. As long as it has pip, you know, it should work. So I think it's not impossible that we could change the default way of thinking about font packages, or the configuration of font packages, in a similar way. And essentially, the tech community already does this with CTAN because they manage tech fonts in their own packages. Admittedly, part of that reason is because they are wanting to preserve PostScript Type 1 fonts that are not going to get packaged elsewhere, but they've managed to make it work at least. But again, I don't want to think that that's the only thing that matters, is slightly less work for QA people. But there are some other things that I think we would get for free if we adopted a similar approach to font packages. The first is that you could quite easily have an actually usable curated recommendation list. And this is a question that comes up all the time. Every time I've been at a font BOF at LibreGraphics meeting, someone's like, we need to have a recommended fonts thing. Everyone wants to know this. There's thousands of fonts on Google Fonts and Open Font Library and in Debian, and there's too many. So what are the good ones? Things that's not really an answerable question. I mean, you have to have context to make that decision, which means you have to have a person saying, these are fonts for making documents, these are fonts for mobile devices, these are fonts that work well together if you have these languages, and so on. Right now, you could certainly have someone just create a list of font names, like a blog might have on a sort of clickbait article. And a lot of web design blogs do this, but all you really have is a font name and then maybe a URL to where it goes. Whereas if you had a way to actually, the user clicks on a link and it helps them install those actual fonts because they're distribution agnostic, that's better. The URLs right here are sort of the few curated open font collections that I'm aware of right now. Use Modify. It's actually a software package by Raphael Bastide, who's at the end there, for sort of publishing a font library yourself. But he maintains his own curated list of what he thinks the good ones are. He's a graphic designer and also a teacher. And that last list down there is his sort of ongoing list of Libre font foundries, and the middle three are examples of curated font collections from that list. Some of the other things on that list are just foundries, whereas the middle three, you get lists of here's what I think are good fonts. And that's not a lot, right? That covers a few people. If you have something that's specific to your language, honestly, those are probably all going to be Latin fonts and not extend much beyond European languages. So we can improve that. Another benefit of sort of rethinking this font package system would be that the packages could live a little bit closer to the upstream font source. A lot of open font packages don't change regularly, but they do change. There are updates and things. And because things are living upstream, the distributions could sort of share the workload of QA whenever something new comes out. In theory, the differences between a Fedora and Debian font package for the same font would be reduced. And in theory, you don't have as much latency between when there's a new update and when the package reaches users. Yeah, those are pretty generic recommendations. It's easy to say that everything will be better. And I'm not trying to make promises about that. But I just would want to note that the shared workload idea has benefits in more than one dimension. Like it's maybe saves the distribution some work, but it also sort of is nicer for the upstream developer. There's also, I think if we have all of our fonts living in the user's home directory, there's going to be less friction between a free software font and a proprietary font on the user system. This is something that graphic designers who want to run Linux or FreeOS actually need. And I know that there are people who sort of tense up at that and say we shouldn't do any work that supports using proprietary fonts. Well, if you want to have a graphic designer, even one using free software, use Debian, then they need to have support for their client's assets, and the client can bring a font to a project that is proprietary. They need to use it for the work they're doing. Right now, it's tricky. And honestly, there are many shades of licensing freedom when it comes to fonts, so it's not quite a black and white issue there. I also think keeping all the fonts in the user's home directory would maybe spur more people to write interesting font tools. I mentioned a few concepts for this last year, like something that converts a PostScript type 1 font to an OTF, something that adds missing OpenType features, something that merges two fonts together. Easy to do that when it's in the user's home directory and you don't have to deal with the apt database getting corrupted and with directories that you don't have permission to access, that sort of thing. And then the last point here is that having all of the user's font choices live in their home directory or in a subdirectory is realistically the only way we're ever going to do synchronization of fonts, which is, again, something that people running proprietary OSs already have. So if you have purchased a bunch of fonts from whoever and you run Mac OS on your laptop and on your desktop machine, you can synchronize those libraries trivially. Synchronizing one directory with flat files, that's a solved problem. Synchronizing Debian and RPM packages, just within one, much less across both. And synchronizing things locally as well, that's just not doable. So, what would it take to actually change the way we package fonts and have them all end up in the user's home directory? Apart from just saying we should change the package definitions and have them install there are some real plumbing issues. For one, we would need to decide what those packages look like, both as how they're delivered and how they actually end up installed in the system. You need some kind of sane structure for where in .local share fonts things end up. Is everything for a font in the same directory? Is it a set of well-known patterns? Do we just thoughtlessly rely on MIME types? If you don't do this, then things like tracking the license that goes with each font can get confused really fast. And then that sort of ties into the fact that we need something that sort of smartly handles when you've downloaded a zip file and you open it up. There's some fonts in there, there's a license file in there, maybe there's like a piece of documentation or something. So it's a known problem, at least in GNOME land. I don't know when that would actually get work done on it, but that same set of questions applies to the font managers. The font managers that exist today don't do a lot with tracking the ancillary material, and that becomes a lot more important when you can just drop a font into .home and accidentally overwrite something. But of course, the big one there is who actually maintains all those font packages. And I've been talking about this as if it's sort of like CPAN or Python package index. Taking that approach means you have to have hosting, you have to build packages, you have to have QA and testing. You probably need like issue tracking. You primarily need a lot of people power. And that's not an easy sell for people. If you want to think maybe more short term, are there like things we could do that would just sort of nudge things in that direction, and maybe we'll see if people are interested. I would say there's some structural issues to the way current font packages are made. You have to avoid name collisions, and you don't want licenses and docs to get lost, and that might mean that we could be more rigorous about checking that we're consistent with Debian font packages. Because when everything is installed in home, where people are also potentially installing stuff from a downloaded zip file, you don't have something like apt catching problems or preventing them. At the same time, all those same questions for the way Debian font packages work belong upstream as well. It would be nice to sort of push the idea upstream that you could have this consistent directory structure, so your family here and then your different weights are in this directory, and then if you have a mono version, that's a separate directory, and things like that. So there's a more standard layout, and your license is always up this file. So that's a sales job, and you can't really sell everyone on a zip file directory structure that you haven't implemented yourself, but it's mostly a conversation. I think there's a bug open in GTK to improve zip download support. If you're a developer interested in that, it's possible to get that working, and it has benefits now that have nothing to do with my crazy ideas about font packaging going in home. And then the last thing there, Type World is a nascent project. that's intended to be like a lightweight update notification system for independent font foundries. So when someone installs a font that they've downloaded, they get a little API key basically, and then a little daemon checks once a day. And when you have a release published on your website, it notices that and it downloads it, and it knows that which person downloaded it, so they still have a current license or something. Not all of that is applicable to open fonts, but this is still in development. There's a lot of people excited about the possibilities it opens up, and this would be the right time to join in that conversation. On the other hand, yeah, this would sort of change would be major. And you know, the first thing there is that apps would have to take responsibility for checking whether fonts are there. You can find a lot of bugs in Snap and Flatpak packages about LibreOffice or whatever not seeing the system fonts, and it was just a packaging error on their part. Obviously, even aside from that, there's going to be a lot of assumptions people have made about where they look for fonts, and you would catch those. It would be good to fix those assumptions, but it would mean breakage in the short term. And yeah, that's a lot of actual work for packagers of other software packages, not the font people. And so that's a big hurdle because you're imposing work on someone else. In addition, you see the third item there, that would be a ton of work for people maintaining packages now to change their packages, and that could not possibly happen quickly. And obviously, in a volunteer project, how would you convince everyone to do this? That's not going to be quick either. Going back up to the first item there, it's not necessarily breakage, but when applications are delivered in these containerized formats like Snap, you're going to end up with duplicate fonts, and you will also end up with duplicate fonts if you have multiple users in your system and they've all installed a package that lives only in their home directory. So realistically, there's going to be a lot of chaos for a while. I mean, the idea of a cross-distribution package sounds really nice, but there are major differences between the way Debian and Red Hat package fonts, from the name of the package to the structure that they live in, right on down the line. So the concept that everyone would have this single format, and it doesn't matter if it's RPM or Debian, is a long way to go before we could agree on what that would look like. And then the last thing there, you're relying more on the upstream project. It's a little bit, upstream has more control, I guess, when there's an easy way to maintain a single font package for everyone. Authors are more likely to do that, and it can result in disagreements. I've seen a number of fonts where the updated release removes things, and that's awkward. A project like Debian might decide we're going to maintain a patch against that, and that could be tricky to convince everyone in other distributions to do. If everyone is, in theory, sharing that workload, you might not agree on whether or not the update should go out, or you should stick with the current version. And a lot of people are going to say, do what upstream does. So the bottom line, is it actually possible? Obviously, the big challenge is how would you set up that big font package archive? And in reality, currently there's no one who's responsible for that sort of thing. Google Fonts has a ton of open fonts, but it's not their responsibility. Their responsibility is to run the Google Fonts service. It's not the same thing as Open Font Library. I know it sounds similar, but Open Font Library is akin to Wikipedia. Anyone can upload things. You rely on a few editors to check that things are licensed properly and are available. And it's not actually the responsibility of the foundries. So probably the big issue is whether or not enough people are interested to work on making this happen. I'm essentially just throwing this out there. I've only been thinking about this since March or April, and I'm eager to get reaction on it. this is the bottom line. It is possible, maybe, but only if a lot of people buy into the idea. So I would like to hear what you think here and what everyone who views the video of this talk later thinks. If you want to read further, the Flatpak bug for Silverblue is there. And again, I may have made this sound like I think this is all dependent on how important the future of Silverblue is. I'm not convinced Silverblue will take over the world at all, of course. Same with Ubuntu Core. Those are transactional OSs, but they may remain niche products. But people have discovered interesting issues this way. Second link there is an attempt by Pathum, open font designer from Sri Lanka, to define a sane structure for font packages. I'd recommend checking that out. The third link there is TypeWorld, which is the subscription delivery and update mechanism I mentioned. That is the thing I think would be useful for working with sync, which again doesn't exist yet. Below that is the DebConf talk I did last year, and at the end there is a blog post I wrote on sort of this topic a couple months ago. That is it for me. I will throw it open for questions or rants or arguments or any of that, because really this is all thought experiment at this point, and I would really like to hear what everyone else has to say about it.
Questions?
Is the microphone on? Okay. This is Yao. I'm actually having an opposite topic on DebConf 19. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that GOFA can actually serve as an intermediate foundation of font packages. Like when you are considering packaging Debian packages, we can actually we can actually request from the format and convert and adapt it to the Debian format or for Flatpak or etc.
Yeah.
So or even like in TypeWorld in macOS, it is also possible. So I'm wondering if that are you also considering about the building the font from source is also important in your project?
Both. I didn't mention either of those things. If I understand your comment correctly, you were noting that the Grand Unified Font Archive Network does not have to host the final packages. If you can build the Debian packages or the RPM packages from that, that's fine too, and that's true. I didn't get into that detail. That does mean you're adding a layer rather than just replacing a layer, so I'm not trying to be prescriptive there, but it just seemed like it would sound more complex if I described it that way, and I was concerned that might turn people off more to the idea, to make it more complex. And it was a second thing. What was the second thing you mentioned?
The building font from source.
Oh, right. Building fonts from source. Yeah, this is a particular concern in reproducible builds because it's not easy, and you find a lot of issues in building fonts because it's pretty manual now. I would always assume that a font package service would do the builds, or at least it would find a way to distinguish between things that do build from source and things that don't, because you might need to have separate archive zones there, because there are going to be people who want to have things installed that it's an OFL font, but there is no source, because one of the peculiarities of OFL is it doesn't require source to be available. The theory being that the Beziers are editable. So yeah, my personal preference would be part of the service would be building the fonts, since that has to happen anyway. But I do feel like you would get people who want to also host things where there is no source. Tech does that. The CTAN has a lot of font packages where there's no source because it's too old. It was just released as a binary under a very liberal license. So, yeah, thanks.
More questions? Right then, thank you very much.
All right, thanks.